December 1941, the German army stood just miles from Moscow. Officers could see the glow of the city in the distance. After months of lightning victories across Europe, Adolf Hitler believed the Soviet Union was about to collapse. The plan had worked everywhere else. Fast tanks, fast planes, fast victories. But what happened next would shock the world. Within weeks, the unstoppable German war machine would face its first major setback. Not from a surprise weapon, not from a secret army, but from snow, steel, and a counterattack no one in Berlin truly expected. If you enjoy powerful World War II storytelling told in a clear and engaging way, make sure you like this video and subscribe to History Plus right now. It helps the channel grow, and it makes sure you never miss the next deep dive into the battles that changed history. By the winter of 1941, Germany had already conquered Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and much of Europe. The strategy was called Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It relied on speed and shock. Armored divisions would punch through enemy lines while aircraft destroyed communications and supply routes. Most countries collapsed within weeks. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, Hitler believed the Soviet Union would fall just as quickly. At first, it seemed he was right. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded. German forces advanced hundreds of miles in just a few months. Cities burned. Roads were filled with refugees. German propaganda declared victory after victory. Many German officers believed the war in the East would be finished before winter. But the Soviet Union was not like the countries Germany had faced before. It was vast beyond imagination. Even as German forces captured territory, Soviet industry was being moved east far beyond the Ural Mountains. Factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and rebuilt in safer regions. Production did not stop. It adapted. As summer turned to autumn, the German advance slowed. Roads in the Soviet Union were often dirt tracks. When heavy rains arrived, those roads turned into thick mud. Tanks sank deep. Supply trucks broke down. Fuel deliveries were delayed. This muddy season, known as Rasputitsa, became a silent enemy. Soldiers who were used to rapid movement now found themselves stuck, waiting, frustrated. Despite these problems, the German High Command pushed forward. Moscow was the ultimate objective. The capital was not only a political center but also a transportation hub. Rail lines connected Moscow to every major front. If the city fell, many believed the Soviet government would collapse. Capturing Moscow before winter became the top priority. By October 1941, German forces launched a massive offensive toward the city. They surrounded large Soviet formations and moved closer to the capital. Panic spread among civilians. Government offices began evacuating. Defensive trenches were dug by soldiers and ordinary citizens alike. The situation looked desperate, but something important was happening behind the scenes. Soviet intelligence had gathered information that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union from the east that winter. This meant divisions stationed in Siberia could be moved west. These troops were experienced, well-trained, and equipped for extreme cold. They were used to harsh winters and deep snow. Their arrival would soon change everything. As November arrived, temperatures began to drop sharply. German soldiers were not prepared for what was coming. Many units lacked proper winter clothing. Engines were not designed for such extreme cold. Oil thickened. Weapons jammed. Frostbite cases increased daily. Soldiers wrapped their boots in cloth and newspaper in desperate attempts to stay warm. The temperature fell far below zero. At times it reached -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Imagine standing outside for hours in that cold, holding a metal rifle, unable to feel your fingers. Now imagine doing that while being shot at. The human body was not built for this, yet both sides endured. Hitler refused to consider a major withdrawal. He believed holding ground was essential. German troops were ordered to stand firm. Retreat was often forbidden. Some generals warned that the army was overstretched and vulnerable. But Hitler saw any withdrawal as weakness. His confidence, built on earlier victories, blinded him to the changing reality. Then, In early December 1941, the Red Army struck back. Fresh Siberian divisions launched coordinated attacks along the front. Supported by tanks like the T-34, which performed well in snow and mud, Soviet forces pushed against exhausted German units. The element of surprise was powerful. Many German soldiers believed the Soviets were finished. Instead, they were facing a growing and determined enemy. The counteroffensive was not just a small push, it was massive. Along hundreds of miles of front line, Soviet troops attacked in freezing conditions. German defensive lines began to bend. In some areas, they broke. Units that had been advancing for months were now fighting desperately just to survive. For the first time in World War II, the German army was forced into a large-scale retreat. This was Hitler's first major setback. The myth of invincibility was shattered. Soldiers who had marched confidently across Europe now struggled through snow, pulling wounded comrades on sleds made from doors and broken carts. Yet this was only the beginning of the winter struggle. The counteroffensive would continue through the harshest months, reshaping the entire Eastern Front. The question now was no longer whether Germany could capture Moscow quickly. The question was whether Germany could recover at all from this shock. And in the freezing forests outside the Soviet capital, the answer was. As the Soviet counteroffensive gained momentum in December 1941, confusion spread through German headquarters. For months, reports had described the Red Army as collapsing, disorganized, and nearly defeated. Now those same reports were being replaced with urgent messages. Fresh Soviet divisions were attacking in strength, German units were being pushed back, and entire positions were becoming impossible to hold. On the ground, the change was brutal and immediate. German soldiers who had spent weeks digging into frozen soil suddenly found themselves under heavy artillery fire followed by infantry assaults. Snow that once seemed like a simple weather problem now became a tactical weapon. Soviet troops in white camouflage blended into the landscape, moving quickly across terrain that slowed German vehicles. Skis, sleds, and light equipment allowed them to maneuver in ways the Germans had not anticipated. The T-34 tank played a major role in this shift. Its wide tracks handled mud and snow better than many German armored vehicles. Its sloped armor deflected shells that might have destroyed older designs. German crews who had once felt superior now faced a machine that could fight effectively in winter conditions. The psychological impact was just as important as the physical damage. Hitler's reaction to the crisis was decisive but controversial. He issued a strict order: no retreat. German units were to hold their positions at all costs. The idea was simple. If troops dug in and defended firmly, the Red Army would exhaust itself against strong defensive lines. In theory, it sounded reasonable. In reality, many German units were exhausted, undersupplied, and freezing. Holding ground without proper winter equipment came at a terrible cost. Generals such as Heinz Guderian and others argued that flexible withdrawals were necessary to shorten the lines and stabilize the front. They warned that refusing to pull back even a few miles could lead to encirclement. But Hitler saw any suggestion of retreat as defeatism. His earlier victories had reinforced his belief that willpower alone could overcome material weakness. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders sensed opportunity. They understood that German supply lines were stretched thin, fuel shortages were common. Trucks broke down in the cold. Horses, still widely used for transport, died from exposure. The further German forces had advanced toward Moscow, the longer their supply routes had become. Winter made those routes fragile. The Red Army targeted weak points along the front. Instead of attacking everywhere with equal strength, they struck areas where German units were already vulnerable. When gaps opened, Soviet forces pushed through quickly, threatening to surround isolated formations. German commanders were forced to make rapid decisions under extreme pressure. In some sectors, the fighting turned into desperate close-quarters combat inside snow-covered villages. Houses changed hands multiple times in a single day. Soldiers fought room to room while icy wind blew through shattered windows. Fires lit. Inside buildings provided brief warmth but also made perfect targets for artillery. Survival often depended on small unit leadership rather than grand strategy. The counteroffensive gradually pushed German forces back from the immediate outskirts of Moscow. The dream of capturing the Soviet capital before winter was officially dead. But the deeper impact went beyond territory. Confidence within the German army was shaken. Soldiers who had believed they were part of an unstoppable force now understood that they could be beaten. At the same time, Soviet morale surged. The defense of Moscow became a symbol of national survival. Radio broadcasts spoke of resilience and sacrifice. Civilians who had dug trenches and built barricades saw that their efforts had not been in vain. The idea that Germany could be stopped, even pushed back, spread across the Soviet Union. Still, the Red Army paid a heavy price. The counteroffensive was costly. Thousands of soldiers fought in brutal cold with limited supplies. Frostbite did not discriminate between attacker and defender. Casualties mounted on both sides. This was not an easy victory. It was a grinding struggle where endurance mattered as much as firepower. By January 1942, the front lines had shifted significantly west of Moscow. German forces were no longer threatening the city directly. However, they were far from destroyed. Despite losses, the German army remained dangerous. Many units managed to establish defensive positions and stabilize parts of the front. Hitler, furious at setbacks, dismissed several senior commanders. He took more direct control of military decisions. This marked a turning point in how the war in the East would be managed. Political authority increasingly overruled professional military judgment. Some historians later argued that this shift would have long-term consequences far beyond the winter of 1941. For the first time since the war began, Germany faced a prolonged conflict on a scale it had not fully prepared for. The quick victory strategy had failed. Instead of collapsing, the Soviet Union had absorbed the Oder and struck back. The winter counteroffensive did not end the war, but it destroyed the illusion that the war would be short. German soldiers now understood they were fighting an enemy with deep reserves of manpower and industrial capacity. Soviet factories relocated to the east were increasing production. Tanks, artillery, and aircraft continued to roll off assembly lines. The longer the war lasted, the more dangerous this would become. As February approached, the intensity of Soviet attacks began to slow. The Red Army had pushed the Germans back significantly, but it too was stretched. Supplies were limited, and coordination across such a massive front was difficult. The fighting settled into a brutal stalemate across frozen fields and forests. Yet the psychological damage to Germany had already been done. The winter counteroffensive proved that Blitzkrieg had limits. Speed and shock could conquer smaller nations, but against the vastness of the Soviet Union, with its harsh climate and massive resources, the strategy faced challenges it could not simply overpower. What began as a confident march toward Moscow had turned into a struggle for survival. And although the war would continue for years, the events of that winter marked the first time the German war machine had been forced backward on such a scale. The setback outside Moscow was not just a military event, it was a warning that this war would demand far more blood, time, and sacrifice than anyone in Berlin had predicted. And as the snow continued to fall across the Eastern Front, both sides prepared for a conflict that was no longer about quick victory, but about endurance. By early 1942, the shock of the winter counteroffensive had settled into a harsh new reality. The German army was still standing, but it was no longer advancing toward Moscow. Instead, it was digging in, rebuilding, and trying to recover from the first major blow of the war. What had once been a confident march east had turned into a grinding fight for survival across frozen ground. Hitler publicly insisted that his decision to order troops to hold their positions had saved the front from total collapse. In some areas, that was partly true. Certain German units managed to form strong defensive lines and prevent deeper Soviet breakthroughs. But the cost was enormous. Thousands of soldiers died not only from combat, but from cold, exhaustion, and lack of proper supplies. The winter had exposed weaknesses in planning that could no longer be ignored. German commanders began reassessing their strategy. They realized that the Soviet Union was not on the brink of collapse. Intelligence failures had underestimated Soviet manpower, industrial capacity, and determination. Even after losing vast territories and millions of soldiers captured or killed, the Red Army continued to fight. Reinforcements kept arriving. Factories in the east were increasing production. The war was becoming a contest of endurance. On the Soviet side, the successful defense of Moscow had a powerful psychological impact. It proved that Germany could be stopped. This victory did not end the suffering. The Eastern Front remained brutal and deadly. But morale changed. The narrative shifted from desperate survival to determined resistance. The Red Army was no longer just reacting. It had shown it could strike back. Still, the counteroffensive did not destroy the German army. By spring, the front stabilized. Both sides were exhausted. Casualties were staggering. Entire divisions had been reduced to shadows of their original strength. Snow slowly melted, revealing the devastation underneath. Destroyed villages, burned vehicles, frozen bodies left where they fell. The winter of 1941-1942 did not end the war, but it changed its direction. Germany's dream of a quick victory in the east was over. The Soviet Union had survived the most dangerous moment of the invasion. And from this point forward, every German plan would have to account for a simple, undeniable truth. The Red Army was still in the fight, and it was learning fast. The first major setback had arrived. The myth of invincibility was broken. What lay ahead would be even larger battles, even greater destruction, and a war that would stretch far beyond what anyone had imagined when German forces first crossed the Soviet border in June 1941. As spring slowly approached in 1942, the snow around Moscow began to melt, but the consequences of that winter did not fade away. What had happened outside the Soviet capital was more than a failed offensive. It was the moment the entire direction of the war began to shift. Germany had entered the Soviet Union expecting a campaign measured in months. Now it was clear the conflict would be measured in years. The winter counteroffensive forced German leaders to confront a hard truth. Blitzkrieg depended on speed, coordination, and momentum. It was designed to shock an enemy into collapse. But in the vast territory of the Soviet Union, distance itself became a weapon. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles. Railways had to be converted. Fuel had to travel across damaged roads. Every mile gained made the German army weaker logistically. The Red Army, despite its terrible losses in 1941, had absorbed the Oder and survived. That survival alone changed global perception. Around the world, observers who once believed Germany was unstoppable now saw proof that it could be pushed back. Even inside occupied Europe, resistance movements quietly took hope from the news that Moscow had not fallen. Inside Germany, however, propaganda tried to control the narrative. The retreat was described as a planned defensive adjustment. The scale of the setback was downplayed, but soldiers writing letters home told a different story. They spoke of frostbite, endless snow, sudden Soviet attacks, and the shock of being forced backward. The psychological shift inside the army could not be erased by speeches. Hitler's decision to take tighter control of military operations during this period would shape the rest of the war. Distrust of senior generals increased. Strategic decisions became more centralized. Flexibility decreased. What had once been a highly mobile and adaptive military machine began to feel the weight of rigid political control. The winter setback did not just damage divisions on the ground. It influenced how Germany would fight from that point forward. For the Soviet Union, the defense of Moscow became a symbol of national survival. It proved that the state, the army, and the people could endure unimaginable pressure. Civilians who had dug trenches, built barricades, and worked in freezing factories felt that their sacrifices mattered. The victory did not mean safety. Far from it. The Eastern Front would become even more violent in the years ahead. But confidence had been restored. When historians look back, they often debate turning points. Some argue that later battles were larger or more decisive. But what happened in the winter of 1941-1942 was the first crack in Germany's image of invincibility. It forced Berlin to abandon the idea of a short war. It proved that the Soviet Union would not collapse under pressure alone. And it demonstrated that climate, logistics, and industrial strength could overcome even the most aggressive military strategy. As the front stabilized, both sides prepared for what would come next. New offensives were planned. Factories increased production. Replacements were trained. The war was evolving into a massive struggle of resources and endurance. The quick, lightning victories of 1939 and 1940 felt distant now. In their place stood a brutal, grinding conflict stretching across thousands of miles. If you think about it, the snow outside Moscow did more than freeze engines and jam rifles. It froze an illusion. The illusion that willpower and speed were enough to conquer a continent-sized nation. The winter counteroffensive did not destroy the German army, but it changed the psychology of the war forever. Here on History Plus, we focus on moments exactly like this. Moments when history could have gone a different way. Moments when a decision, a delay, or even the weather altered the course of millions of lives. And the winter of 1941 is one of those moments. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe this was the true turning point of the war in the East? Or do you think later battles had a greater impact? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective makes the discussion stronger. If you found this deep dive valuable, share this video with someone who loves military history. It helps the channel grow and brings more people into the conversation. And if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to History Plus so you don't miss the next chapter in this incredible and complex story. Because the war did not end in that winter. It was only beginning to reveal its true scale.